The day I married David, I thought I was gaining the perfect family. His father shook my hand with that warm smile and said, "Welcome to the family, sweetheart. You're like the daughter I never had." Those words should have filled me with joy. Instead, they became the beginning of my nightmare. "Hello, my name is Sarah, but you can call me Grandma Rose. I'm 71 years old, and today I'm sharing a story I've kept buried for over 30 years. A story about how the man who was supposed to protect me as family became my greatest tormentor." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When I first met the Harrison family in the spring of 1987, everything seemed like a fairy tale. I was 23 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in elementary education, and working at Riverside Elementary School in Portland, Oregon. David Harrison was a 26-year-old engineer I'd met at a coffee shop downtown. Tall, kind, with gentle brown eyes that made me feel safe in a way I'd never experienced before. Our courtship was something straight out of a romantic movie. David would pick me up after work with flowers from his mother's garden, take me to quiet restaurants where we'd talk for hours about our dreams, our families, our hopes for the future. He was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner: respectful, intelligent, ambitious. But most importantly, he came from what appeared to be the most loving family I'd ever encountered. The Harrison family lived in a beautiful colonial house in the prestigious Cedar Hills neighborhood of Portland. The house itself was a testament to success: white columns framing the front porch, perfectly manicured lawns, and flower beds that looked like they belonged in a magazine. When David first brought me home to meet his parents, I remember feeling intimidated by the sheer elegance of it all. Margaret Harrison, David's mother, was a petite woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked auburn hair always perfectly styled. She had been a nurse before marrying, but had devoted herself entirely to being a homemaker and mother. The moment I met her, she enveloped me in a warm hug that smelled of vanilla and lavender. "David has told us so much about you, dear," she said, her voice carrying that gentle Southern accent she'd never quite lost despite living in Oregon for 20 years. "I can see why he's so smitten." But it was Richard Harrison, David's father, who truly commanded the room. At 54, he was an imposing figure, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with salt and pepper hair, piercing blue eyes, and the kind of confident presence that made everyone around him feel both important and slightly nervous. Richard was a successful real estate developer who had built his company, Harrison Properties, from the ground up. Everyone in Portland knew the Harrison name, associated with luxury developments and commercial buildings throughout the city. "So you're the young lady who's captured our son's heart," Richard said that first evening, taking my hand in both of his in what seemed like a fatherly gesture. His hands were large, warm, and his grip lingered just a moment longer than necessary. "David's shown excellent judgment as usual. You're even more beautiful than he described." The compliment should have made me blush with pleasure, but something about the way his eyes traveled over me made me feel exposed, as if he were appraising me like one of his real estate investments. I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself I was being overly sensitive. This was David's father, after all, a respected businessman, a family man, someone who had raised the wonderful man I was falling in love with. That first dinner was magical in every other way. Margaret had prepared a feast: roast beef with all the trimmings, homemade bread that filled the house with the most incredible aroma, and apple pie that tasted like heaven. The dining room was elegant but warm, with family photos covering the walls and fresh flowers from Margaret's garden adorning the table. David had 2 younger sisters, Jennifer, who was 21 and studying pre-med at Oregon State, and Rebecca, who was 19 and working as a receptionist while taking night classes in business administration. Both girls welcomed me with genuine warmth, immediately including me in their sisterly, banter, and making me feel like I'd known them for years. Finally, someone to help us gang up on David, Jennifer laughed, passing me the mashed potatoes. He's been insufferably smug since he started dating you, going on and on about how perfect you are. Jenny, David protested, his ears turning red. I do not go on and on. Oh, yes, you do, Rebecca chimed in. Sarah this, Sarah that. You should see how great she is with kids. She's so smart and funny. She makes the best chocolate chip cookies. We were beginning to think you'd made her up. Richard laughed heartily at his daughter's teasing. Now, girls, leave your brother alone. When a man finds a treasure, he can't help but show it off. Again, that lingering look, that appraising gaze that made my skin prickle with discomfort. Throughout the evening, Richard regaled us with stories from his business dealings, his adventures in real estate, his plans for expanding Harrison Properties into Seattle and beyond. He was undeniably charismatic, the kind of man who commanded attention without demanding it. Margaret hung on his every word, gazing at him with the kind of adoration that spoke of a marriage built on genuine love and respect. Your father is quite the storyteller, I whispered to David as we helped clear the dishes after dinner. He's always been larger than life, David replied with obvious pride. Growing up, I thought he could do anything. He built his first house with his own hands when he was just 25, you know. Mom always says he could have been anything, lawyer, politician, actor. But he chose real estate because he loves building things that last. As the weeks passed and I became more integrated into the Harrison family circle, I began to understand the dynamics that made this family tick. Margaret was the heart of the home, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, who cooked elaborate Sunday dinners, who made sure the house ran like clockwork. The girls were typical young women, focused on their studies and careers, but always ready to come home for family gatherings and holidays. David was clearly the golden child, the son who had followed most closely in his father's footsteps. With his engineering career, his ambitious nature, his drive to succeed, Richard spoke of David with obvious pride, often telling anyone who would listen about his son's latest project, his promotions, his achievements. And Richard himself was the undisputed patriarch, the provider, the decision-maker whose word was law in the Harrison household. What Richard wanted, Richard got. When he decided the family would vacation in Hawaii that summer, plane tickets were booked. When he announced they were remodeling the kitchen, contractors appeared the next week. When he expressed interest in a particular restaurant or activity, that became the family's plan for the evening. But it wasn't tyrannical. At least it didn't seem that way at the time. Richard's authority came with genuine care for his family. He paid for Jennifer's medical school tuition without a second thought. He bought Rebecca a car when she needed reliable transportation to her job. He surprised Margaret with weekend trips to San Francisco and Seattle just because he knew she loved to travel. Dad's old-fashioned that way, David explained when I commented on his father's somewhat traditional approach to family leadership. He believes the man should be the provider and protector. It might seem outdated to some people, but it works. For our family, Mom loves being taken care of, and we all respect Dad's judgment. He's never steered us wrong. I found myself drawn into this warm, secure family environment like a moth to flame. Coming from a much more modest background, my parents were both teachers who had divorced when I was 16, and money had always been tight. The Harrison family's stability and prosperity felt like everything I'd ever dreamed of. My own father had left Oregon when I was 17, moving to Arizona with his new girlfriend, and gradually fading from my life through sporadic phone calls and forgotten birthdays. My mother had thrown herself into her work, becoming distant and somewhat bitter about relationships in general. The contrast between my fractured family and David's close-knit clan was stark and appealing. Richard seemed to sense my background and went out of his way to make me feel included and valued. When David mentioned that I was struggling with my student loan payments on my teacher's salary, Richard quietly arranged for me to tutor some of the children in his upscale developments at premium rates. When my car broke down and I couldn't afford to fix it, he connected me with a mechanic, who somehow managed to get the parts at cost, though I later suspected Richard had paid the difference himself. "You're family now," he told me one evening after David had stepped out to take a business call. We were alone in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and awards from various business organizations. "And family takes care of family. Don't you worry about these little financial bumps, sweetheart. We've all been there." The way he said sweetheart should have been paternal, comforting. Instead, something about his tone, the way his eyes lingered on my face, made me shift uncomfortably in my chair. But when David returned a moment later, Richard's expression was perfectly normal, fatherly, and appropriate. I convinced myself I was imagining things. After all, Richard Harrison was a pillar of the community, a devoted husband and father, a successful businessman with an impeccable reputation. The idea that he might be looking at me as anything other than his future daughter-in-law was ridiculous, the product of an overactive imagination influenced by too many cautionary tales from my more cynical friends. By Christmas of 1987, David and I had been dating for 8 months, and I had become a fixture at Harrison family gatherings. Margaret treated me like the daughter she'd always wanted, sharing recipes and gardening tips, asking my opinion on everything from holiday decorations to family vacation plans. Jennifer and Rebecca had fully accepted me as their future sister-in-law, including me in their shopping trips and movie nights, and Richard continued to be the perfect future father-in-law, generous, welcoming, protective in all the right ways. When a co-worker at the school made inappropriate comments about my appearance, David mentioned it to his father, and somehow that co-worker found himself transferred to another district within the week. Richard never said anything about it directly, but his knowing smile told me he'd had something to do with the man's sudden departure. "That's what family does," he said simply when I tried to thank him. "We protect what's precious to us." The Harrison family Christmas was like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. The house was decorated to perfection, with garlands and lights adorning every surface, a massive tree in the living room, and the smell of cinnamon and pine filling every room. Margaret had been cooking for days, preparing all of David's favorite dishes and asking me what I'd like her to include in the menu. On Christmas morning, I sat in their living room in my new red dress, a gift from Margaret, watching this family exchange presents with genuine love and joy. Richard played Santa, distributing gifts with theatrical flair that made everyone laugh. When he handed me a beautifully wrapped box, I was surprised to find an expensive gold bracelet inside. "Richard, this is too much," I protested, holding up the delicate chain that probably cost more than I made in a month. "Nonsense," he replied, his hand briefly touching my shoulder as he leaned over to help me with the clasp. "Nothing's too good for family. Besides," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper that only I could hear, "beautiful women deserve beautiful things." Again, that uncomfortable flutter in my stomach, that sense that something wasn't quite right. But surrounded by the warmth of family Christmas morning, with David beaming beside me and Margaret taking pictures of everyone in their new gifts, it was easy to push those feelings aside. That afternoon, as we all sat around the living room digesting Margaret's incredible feast, Richard raised his glass of wine in a toast. "To family," he said, his eyes moving around the room but lingering on me. "To the blessings we have, and to the new blessings coming our way." Everyone raised their glasses, and David squeezed my hand, both of us knowing that an engagement couldn't be far off. I felt surrounded by love, by acceptance, by the promise of a beautiful future with the most wonderful family I could have imagined. If only I had known then what lay beneath the surface of all that perfection. If only I had trusted those uncomfortable feelings, those moments when something felt just slightly off. If only I had understood that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who appear most trustworthy, most respectable, most above, suspicion. But I was young, in love, and desperate for the kind of family stability I'd never had. The Harrison family seemed like a dream come true, and Richard Harrison seemed like the father I'd always wished for. I had no idea that my nightmare was just beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The proposal came on Valentine's Day 1988, exactly 1 year after we'd first met. David had planned everything perfectly. Dinner at the elegant Heathman Hotel in downtown Portland, followed by a moonlit walk through the rose gardens at Washington Park. When he dropped to one knee beside the fountain, presenting a gorgeous, emerald-cut diamond ring, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. "Sarah Michelle Thompson," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Will you marry me and make me the happiest man alive?" Through my tears of joy, I could barely whisper, "Yes," before he slipped the ring onto my finger. It was perfect. Not too flashy, but clearly expensive. Exactly the kind of ring I would have chosen for myself if I'd had the courage to dream that big. When we returned to the Harrison house to share the news, the celebration was everything I'd hoped for. Margaret burst into tears of happiness, immediately pulling me into her arms and whispering, "I've been praying for this day since David first brought you home." Jennifer and Rebecca squealed with excitement, immediately demanding to see the ring, and begin planning engagement parties and bridal showers. Richard's reaction was perhaps the most touching of all. He stood up from his leather armchair, his eyes misty with what appeared to be genuine emotion, and crossed the room to embrace us both. "Welcome to the family officially," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "I couldn't be prouder to call you my daughter." But as he hugged me, something felt different from his previous embraces. His arms lingered around me a moment too long. His hands pressed against my back in a way that seemed more intimate than fatherly. When he finally released me, his smile was warm and appropriate. But I caught something in his eyes, a look I couldn't quite identify but that made my stomach flutter with unease. "David's a lucky man," Richard continued, his gaze holding mine for just a beat too long. "He's getting himself a real treasure." The wedding planning began immediately, and I threw myself into it with the enthusiasm of every bride-to-be. Margaret insisted on helping with everything, from choosing the venue to selecting flowers to tasting cakes. It was like having the mother I'd always dreamed of, someone who genuinely cared about making my special day perfect. Richard, true to his generous nature, insisted on paying for the entire wedding. It's tradition for the bride's family to handle the expenses. My mother had protested during one family dinner, clearly uncomfortable with accepting such an enormous gift. "Nonsense, Patricia," Richard had replied with that charming smile that made everyone feel special. "Sarah is family now, and family takes care of family. Besides, I only have one son getting married. Let me spoil him, and her, a little." The gesture was incredibly generous, but it also meant that Richard had significant input into every aspect of our wedding planning. He joined us for venue visits, cake tastings, meetings with florists and photographers. At first, I was touched by his involvement. It felt like having a caring father figure who wanted everything to be perfect for his son's wedding. But gradually, I began to notice things that made me uncomfortable. During our appointment with the wedding dress designer, Richard insisted on coming along to make sure we get the best service. While I was in the fitting room trying on gowns, I could hear his voice through the curtain, offering opinions about necklines and silhouettes in a way that seemed overly interested in my body rather than the overall aesthetic of the dress. "That one's beautiful, sweetheart," he called out when I emerged in a strapless ball gown. "But maybe something with a little more coverage? We want to save something for the wedding night, don't we?" His comment made the bridal consultant look uncomfortable, and I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. David, who had been looking at his phone, glanced up with a confused expression. "Dad, that's a pretty normal wedding dress style," he said, mildly. Of course, Richard backtracked smoothly. I'm just old-fashioned. Sarah looks beautiful in everything anyway. During our cake tasting appointment, Richard positioned himself next to me at the small table, his leg pressing against mine as we sampled different flavors. When I shifted away, he moved closer, ostensibly to reach for a sample, but really to maintain that inappropriate contact. His hand brushed against my thigh when he reached for his water glass, and when I looked at him sharply, he winked as if we were sharing some kind of private joke. Careful with all that sugar, sweetheart, he said, watching me taste a particularly rich chocolate sample. We want to make sure you still fit in that dress come September. The comment stung, especially since I'd always been self-conscious about my weight. David immediately protested. Dad, Sarah looks perfect. Don't listen to him, honey. Oh, I'm just teasing, Richard laughed, but his eyes remained serious as they traveled over my figure. She's gorgeous just the way she is. David's getting himself a real prize. These incidents might have seemed minor to an outside observer, just an overly involved father-in-law with poor boundaries. But they began to form a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Richard always seemed to find reasons to touch me, a hand on my shoulder when he passed behind my chair, a lingering hug when we arrived or left family gatherings, his arm around my waist when Margaret insisted on taking family photos. The touching was always brief enough and public enough that it seemed innocent to anyone watching. But something about the way his hands lingered, the way his fingers would stroke my arm or back, felt wrong. When I mentioned it to David one evening, he looked genuinely puzzled. Dad's always been affectionate, he said, clearly not understanding my concern. He hugs everyone. It's just his way. You're probably just not used to having such a warm, close family. His explanation made sense on the surface, and I wanted to believe it. After coming from a cold, distant family environment, maybe I was just oversensitive to normal displays of familial affection. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. The breaking point came during a family barbecue in July, about 2 months before our wedding. It was a typical Harrison gathering, extended family, family friends, business associates, and neighbors all mingling in their beautiful backyard. Margaret had outdone herself with the food, and Richard was in his element as host, regaling everyone with stories and jokes. I was wearing a sundress, nothing inappropriate, just a simple yellow cotton dress that hit just above my knees. The weather was warm, and everyone was dressed casually for the outdoor event. I was helping Margaret bring drinks out from the kitchen when Richard approached me near the back door, away from the main crowd. You look beautiful today, Sarah, he said, his voice lower than usual. That dress is very flattering. Thank you, I replied, trying to step around him to get back to the party. But he moved slightly, blocking my path without making it obvious to anyone who might be watching. David's a lucky man, he continued, his eyes moving over my body in a way that made my skin crawl. I hope he appreciates what he's getting. Before I could respond, his hand reached out and touched my bare arm, his thumb stroking my skin in a way that was definitely not fatherly. Such soft skin, he murmured, and I felt frozen, unsure how to react without causing a scene. Richard, I need to get these drinks to the guests, I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. Of course, sweetheart, he replied, finally stepping aside, but not before his hand brushed against my hip as I passed. We can't keep our guests waiting. I rejoined the party with my heart pounding, trying to act normal while processing what had just happened. For the rest of the evening, I was hyper-aware of Richard's presence, noticing how he always seemed to position himself where he could watch me, how his eyes followed me around the yard. When David found me later, sitting alone on the porch swing, trying to calm my nerves, he immediately sensed something was wrong. Are you feeling okay? You seem quiet. I wanted to tell him about his father's behavior, about the inappropriate touching and comments, about the way Richard looked at me like I was something he wanted to possess rather than his future daughter-in-law. But how could I explain something so subtle, so carefully disguised as normal family interaction? "I'm just tired," I said instead. "It's been a long day." David sat beside me, taking my hand in his. "You know, sometimes I can't believe how lucky I am," he said softly. "Finding someone like you, having you become part of our family. Dad was just saying how much you've brought to all of our lives." The irony of his words made my stomach turn. If only David knew what his father had really been saying to me, how he'd been looking at me, touching me. But I couldn't bring myself to shatter his illusions about his family, especially not 2 months before our wedding. That night, lying awake in my small apartment, I seriously considered calling off the engagement. Not because I didn't love David, I loved him more than I'd ever loved anyone, but the thought of becoming permanently tied to Richard Harrison, of having him as a father-in-law for the rest of my life, filled me with dread. But where could I go? What could I do? I had no real evidence of inappropriate behavior, just a collection of uncomfortable moments that could easily be explained away as misunderstandings or oversensitivity on my part. Richard was a respected member of the community, a devoted family man, a generous father and husband. Who would believe that he was making his future daughter-in-law uncomfortable? Moreover, I genuinely loved the rest of the Harrison family. Margaret had become like a mother to me. Jennifer and Rebecca were the sisters I'd never had, and David was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. Was I really going to throw all of that away because of some uncomfortable feelings about his father? Convinced myself that things would get better after the wedding. Once David and I were married and living in our own home, I wouldn't have to spend as much time around Richard. The inappropriate behavior would surely stop once I was officially his daughter-in-law, rather than just his son's girlfriend. I was probably imagining half of it anyway, reading sinister intentions into innocent actions because of my own insecurities and family history. The wedding preparations continued throughout the summer, and I threw myself into the details as a way of avoiding my growing anxiety about Richard. We found a beautiful venue, the historic Pittock Mansion overlooking the city, and Margaret helped me choose a stunning dress that was elegant and modest, exactly what I'd dreamed of wearing on my wedding day. Richard continued to be generous and involved, but I became expert at avoiding situations where we might be alone together. I made sure Margaret or one of the girls was always present during wedding planning meetings. I positioned myself strategically at family gatherings to minimize his opportunities for inappropriate contact. I developed a repertoire of polite but firm responses to his comments about my appearance. But the feeling of being watched, of being evaluated and desired in a way that made my skin crawl, never went away. Richard's behavior became more subtle as the wedding approached, but it was still there, in the way his eyes lingered on me during family dinners, in the way he found excuses to stand close to me, in the way he spoke to me with an intimacy that felt wrong coming from my future father-in-law. 2 weeks before the wedding, during our final dress fitting, Margaret made a comment that chilled me to the bone. We were alone in the bridal shop while I tried on my completed gown, and she was adjusting the train with tears of happiness in her eyes. "You know, dear," she said softly, "Richard has been so excited about this wedding. I haven't seen him this happy about anything in years. He keeps saying how perfect you are for David, how lucky our family is to be getting you." Her words were meant to be comforting, but something about her tone made me look at her more closely. There was something in her expression, a sadness, a weariness that seemed at odds with her happy words. "He's been very generous," I replied carefully, watching her face in the mirror. Margaret's hands stilled on my dress for a moment. "Yes, Richard is always generous with the people he cares about," she said quietly. "Sometimes I think he cares a little too much, if you know what I mean." Our eyes met in the mirror, and for just a moment, I saw something that looked like a warning, a recognition. an understanding that made my blood run cold. But before I could say anything, Margaret's expression brightened again, and she was back to fussing with my dress, as if the moment had never happened. "There," she said with forced cheerfulness. "Perfect. You're going to be the most beautiful bride Portland has ever seen." As I stood there in my wedding dress, looking at myself in the mirror, I felt a creeping sense of dread that had nothing to do with normal pre-wedding nerves. Something was very wrong in the Harrison family. Something that went deeper than Richard's inappropriate behavior toward me. But I was trapped now, wasn't I? The invitations had been sent, the deposits paid, the flowers ordered. My entire future was tied up with David and his family. There was no going back now, even if I wanted to. I just had to hope that marriage would change things, that distance and boundaries would solve the problem, that Richard would learn to see me as his daughter-in-law rather than whatever he saw me as now. I had no idea how wrong I was, or how much worse things were about to become. September 15th, 1988, dawned, crisp and clear, the perfect Portland autumn day for a wedding. As I sat in the bridal suite at the Pittock Mansion, surrounded by Margaret, Jennifer, Rebecca, and my mother, I should have been the happiest woman in the world. My dress was perfect, my makeup flawless, and in just 2 hours, I would be marrying the love of my life. But beneath all the excitement and joy, that familiar knot of anxiety sat heavy in my stomach. Every time someone mentioned how proud Richard was, how excited he was to officially welcome me into the family, that uncomfortable feeling intensified. "Sarah, honey, you need to eat something," my mother said, holding out a plate of fruit and pastries that Margaret had brought from the hotel restaurant. "You're going to faint at the altar if you don't get some food in you." I managed a few bites, more to satisfy her than because I was hungry. The truth was, my appetite had been almost non-existent for weeks. Between normal wedding stress and my growing anxiety about Richard, I'd lost nearly 10 pounds, something Margaret had noticed and commented on with concern. Pre-wedding nerves, I'd explained, and everyone had accepted that reasonable explanation. No one knew about the real source of my stress, the way Richard's behavior had become increasingly bold as the wedding approached. Just 3 days earlier, during the rehearsal dinner, he had cornered me in the hotel's coat room while I was retrieving Margaret's sweater. "Cold feet?" he'd asked, stepping close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the scotch he'd been drinking all evening. "Not at all," I'd replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm excited to marry David." "Good," he'd said, his hand reaching out to touch my cheek in a gesture that was far too intimate for a father-in-law. "Because once you're family, officially family, things are going to be different. Better. We're going to be much closer, you and I." The way he'd said closer had sent chills down my spine. But before I could respond, Margaret's voice had called out from the dining room, asking if I'd found her sweater. Richard had stepped back smoothly, his expression returning to that of a normal, caring father-in-law. "Better get back," he'd said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can't keep the family waiting." Now, sitting in my wedding dress, I pushed those memories away and focused on the present moment. In less than an hour, I would be Mrs. David Harrison, and surely that would change everything. Richard would have to respect boundaries once I was officially his daughter-in-law. The inappropriate behavior would stop because it would have to stop. The ceremony itself was everything I'd dreamed of and more. The Pittock Mansion was decorated with white roses and ivy, creating an elegant backdrop for our vows. David looked incredibly handsome in his black tuxedo, and when he saw me walking down the aisle, tears of joy streamed down his face. As my mother walked me toward the altar, my absent father's role filled by my high school principal, Mr. Edwards, who had been like a father figure to me, I felt a moment of pure happiness. This was right. David was right. Our future together was going to be beautiful. The ceremony was performed by Pastor Williams from the Harrison family's church, a kind man in his 60s who had known David since he was a child. As we exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of our lives, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in months. But during the reception, that peace began to erode. Richard had been drinking steadily throughout the cocktail hour, and his behavior became increasingly inappropriate as the evening progressed. During our father-daughter dance, a tradition where the bride dances with her father-in-law since my own father wasn't present, his hands wandered to places they shouldn't go. "You're so beautiful tonight, Sarah," he whispered in my ear as we swayed to the music. "David's the luckiest man in the world, but he doesn't even know what he's got, does he?" His hand, which should have been resting respectfully on my waist, kept sliding lower, and when I tried to adjust his position, he would move it back down again. "Richard, please," I whispered, hoping no one else could see what was happening. "Please what?" he asked innocently, but his grip tightened, pulling me closer against him. "I'm just dancing with my new daughter. Nothing wrong with that, is there?" When the song finally ended, I escaped to the ladies' room, my hands shaking. As I tried to compose myself, Margaret found me there a few minutes later, touching up my lipstick with trembling fingers. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked, but something in her tone suggested she might already know the answer. "Fine," I managed. "Just overwhelmed by everything. It's been such a big day." Margaret studied my reflection in the mirror, and again, I caught that flash of something, knowledge, resignation, sadness, that I'd seen during my dress fitting. "Sarah," she said quietly, "if you ever need someone to talk to, about anything, I want you to know you can come to me. Sometimes family situations can be complicated." Before I could ask what she meant, Rebecca burst through the door, laughing and slightly tipsy from champagne. "There you are. Everyone's looking for you. Time to cut the cake." The moment was lost, but Margaret's words stayed with me for the rest of the evening. What had she meant by complicated family situations? Did she know about Richard's behavior? Had other women in the family experienced similar problems? The rest of the reception passed in a blur of congratulations, dancing, and celebration. David was in his element, beaming with happiness as he introduced me to business associates and family friends as my beautiful wife. I managed to avoid being alone with Richard for the remainder of the evening, staying close to David or other family members. Our honeymoon was a week in Hawaii, Richard's wedding gift to us, and for 7 blissful days, I managed to forget about my father-in-law and his inappropriate behavior. David and I explored Maui, lounged on pristine beaches, and made love with the passion of newlyweds. It was everything a honeymoon should be, and I returned to Portland feeling optimistic about our future. We had purchased a small craftsman house in the Hawthorne district, about 20 minutes from the Harrison family home. It was modest compared to the grandeur of David's childhood home, but it was ours, and I threw myself into making it perfect. I painted walls, planted a garden, and arranged our wedding gifts with care. For the first few weeks of married life, my strategy of maintaining distance from Richard seemed to be working. We saw the family every Sunday for dinner, as was tradition, but these gatherings felt different now that I was married. I was David's wife, with my own home and my own life, not just a girlfriend who could be cornered and made uncomfortable. Richard's behavior during these Sunday dinners was perfectly appropriate. He was charming and fatherly, asking about my job at the elementary school, praising my cooking when I brought desserts, and treating me with the respect due to his son's wife. I began to think that perhaps I had been overreacting before the wedding, that marriage had indeed changed the dynamic, as I'd hoped. But my sense of security was shattered on a rainy Thursday evening in October, just 6 weeks after our wedding. David had been called away on an emergency at one of his construction sites, a burst pipe that was threatening to flood a new office building. He would be gone for hours, dealing with contractors and insurance adjusters. I was home alone, grading, papers at our kitchen table when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Richard standing on our front porch, holding what appeared to be a bottle of wine and wearing a raincoat that was dripping from the downpour outside. "Hi, Richard," I said, opening the door with surprise. "David's not here. He had an emergency at work." "I know," he replied, stepping into our foyer without waiting for an invitation. He called to tell us about the pipe situation. I thought, you might like some company on such a miserable night. Something about his presence in my home, alone with me for the first time since our marriage, made my instincts scream danger. But what could I do? He was my father-in-law, and turning him away would seem incredibly rude and suspicious. "That's very thoughtful," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Would you like some coffee? I was just grading papers." "Actually, I brought this bottle of Cabernet that I thought we could share," he said, holding up the wine. "It's been a stressful week at work, and I could use a drink. How about you?" I rarely drank alcohol on weeknights, especially when I had school the next day, but refusing seemed like it would make the situation more awkward. "Sure, just a small glass." Richard made himself at home in our kitchen, opening the wine and pouring 2 generous glasses while I cleared my papers from the table. He was acting perfectly normal, asking about my students and my lesson plans, but something about his presence felt predatory in a way I couldn't quite define. "You've done a beautiful job with the house," he said, settling into the chair next to mine instead of across from me. "David's a lucky man, having such a talented wife to make a home for him." "Thank you," I replied, taking a small sip of wine and immediately regretting it. The alcohol was already making me feel slightly lightheaded, and I realized I hadn't eaten. "Dinner yet?" "You know, Sarah," Richard continued, his voice taking on that intimate tone that always made me uncomfortable. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation before the wedding, about how things would be different once you were officially family." My stomach dropped. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't you?" he asked, moving his chair closer to mine. "I think you know exactly what I mean. I've seen the way you look at me, the way you respond when I touch you. There's something between us, isn't there?" I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the kitchen floor. "Richard, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I love David, and I'm happy to be part of your family, but—" "Sit down, Sarah," he said, and his tone had changed completely. Gone was the charming father-in-law, replaced by someone I'd never seen before, someone cold and controlling. "We need to have this conversation. I think you should leave," I said, my voice shaking. "David will be home soon." "No, he won't," Richard replied calmly. "That pipe situation is going to keep him busy until well past midnight. I made sure of that." The implication of his words hit me like a physical blow. He had somehow arranged this emergency, orchestrated this situation, to get me alone. "What are you talking about?" Richard stood up, and suddenly our small kitchen felt incredibly cramped. He was a large man, and he used his size to intimidate me, stepping close enough that I had to back against the counter. "I'm talking about the fact that I've wanted you since the first day David brought you home," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I've been patient, respectful, waiting for the right time. And now that you're family, now that you're tied to us permanently, we can explore this attraction properly." "There's no attraction," I said firmly, though my voice was trembling. "You're my father-in-law. This is completely inappropriate." "Is it?" he asked, reaching out to touch my face. I jerked away, but there was nowhere to go with the counter behind me. "You're not really my daughter, Sarah. We're not related by blood. And I saw the way you looked at me during the wedding planning, the way you responded to my touches. You wanted this too." "No," I said, my voice getting stronger. "You're wrong. I never wanted this." I was uncomfortable, but I didn't know how to say anything without causing problems in the family. Richard's expression darkened. "Problems in the family?" "Let me tell you about problems, Sarah. David's career depends on my connections, my recommendations." This house you're living in? I co-signed the mortgage. Your student loans that mysteriously got paid off as a wedding gift? That was me. Your entire comfortable life is built on my generosity. The threat was clear, and it terrified me more than his physical presence. He was right. David's engineering firm did a lot of work with Harrison Properties and their associates. Our financial stability was intimately connected to Richard's goodwill. What do you want? I whispered. I want what I've always wanted, he said, his hand finally making contact with my cheek despite my attempts to avoid it. I want you to be grateful for everything I've done for you and David. I want you to show me that gratitude in a way that befits our special relationship. His thumb stroked my cheek and I felt physically sick. Richard, please. I'm married to your son. I love David. And you can continue loving David, he said reasonably, as if we were discussing something mundane. This doesn't have to affect your marriage at all. In fact, it will make our family closer, more connected. You'll see. Before I could protest further, his other hand grabbed my wrist and he pulled me against him. Just one kiss, he whispered, to seal our new understanding. I struggled against his grip, but he was much stronger than me. No, Richard, stop. Shh, he said, his face moving closer to mine. Don't fight this, Sarah. You know you want it too. Just as his lips were about to touch mine, we heard the sound of a car door slamming in our driveway. Richard immediately released me, stepping back and smoothing his hair as if nothing had happened. David's home early, he said calmly, picking up his wine glass. What good timing. I stood frozen against the counter, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. When David walked through the front door a moment later, calling out a greeting, I couldn't find my voice to respond. In here, son, Richard called back cheerfully. I stopped by to keep Sarah company during your emergency. Hope you don't mind that I opened that bottle of Cabernet I've been saving. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking tired and frustrated from his work crisis. Hi, honey, he said, kissing my cheek. Sorry I'm so late. Dad, thanks for keeping Sarah company. I hated leaving her alone on such an awful night. My pleasure, Richard replied, and the double meaning in his words made my skin crawl. Sarah and I had a very enlightening conversation. Didn't we, sweetheart? I managed to nod, not trusting my voice. David didn't notice my distress, too focused on describing the pipe disaster and the hours of work it had taken to resolve it. Well, I should let you two get to bed, Richard said after listening to David's story. It's been a long night for everyone. He moved toward the door, but as he passed me, his hand brushed against my arm. We'll continue our conversation soon. Sarah, I look forward to it. After he left, David immediately noticed my pale complexion and shaky hands. Are you feeling all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Just tired, I managed. It's been a long day. That night, lying in bed next to my sleeping husband, I stared at the ceiling and tried to process what had happened. Richard had made his intentions crystal clear, and he'd also made it obvious that he had significant power over our lives. If I told David what had happened, would he believe me? And even if he did, what would it do to his relationship with his family? Moreover, Richard had been clever about it. He hadn't actually done anything that couldn't be explained away as a misunderstanding. He'd touched my face and tried to kiss me, but I had no witnesses, no proof. It would be my word against that of a respected businessman and family patriarch. I was trapped, and Richard knew it. He had carefully constructed a situation where he held all the power, where speaking out would cost me everything I'd gained by marrying David. As I lay there in the darkness, I realized that my worst fears about marriage hadn't been unfounded. Things hadn't gotten better after the wedding. They had gotten infinitely worse, and this was just the beginning. The weeks following Richard's visit to our home were a nightmare of anxiety and hypervigilance. Every phone call made me jump, Every unexpected visitor at the door sent my heart racing. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when he would make his next move. David noticed my increasing nervousness but attributed it to the stress of being a newlywed adjusting to married life. "You've been so jumpy lately," he said one morning as I nearly dropped my coffee mug when the neighbor's dog barked unexpectedly. "Maybe you should consider taking some of those yoga classes Margaret's always talking about. They're supposed to be great for stress." If only he knew the real source of my stress was his own father. I wanted desperately to tell him what had happened, but Richard's threats about David's career and our financial security kept me silent. Every time I started to form the words, I imagined the devastation it would cause, not just to David, but to the entire Harrison family. Richard was smart about his approach. He didn't contact me directly for nearly 3 weeks after that night in our kitchen, letting the fear and anticipation build. When he finally made his next move, it was subtle and calculated. I was grocery shopping at the upscale market in downtown Portland when I felt someone approach me from behind in the produce section. I turned to find Richard standing there with his own shopping cart, dressed casually in khakis and a polo shirt, looking like any other suburban father running errands. "What a pleasant surprise," he said loudly enough for other shoppers to hear. "Sarah, darling, how lovely to see you." He leaned in to give me what appeared to be a normal, familial hug, but his hands lingered on my back, and his lips brushed against my ear as he whispered, "We need to finish our conversation soon. I've been very patient." When he pulled back, his expression was perfectly pleasant, grandfatherly even. To anyone watching, we looked like a loving father-in-law and daughter-in-law having a chance encounter while shopping. "How are you settling into married life?" he asked in a normal conversational tone, but his eyes held a predatory gleam that made my stomach turn. "Fine," I managed, gripping my shopping cart handle so tightly my knuckles turned white. "David and I are very happy." "I'm so glad to hear that," Richard replied. "Family happiness is so important, don't you think? We all need to do our part to keep the family strong and united." The underlying threat in his words was unmistakable. He chatted for a few more minutes about mundane topics: the weather, Margaret's garden, David's latest project at work, all while maintaining that pleasant facade that would fool any casual observer. "Well, I should let you get back to your shopping," he said finally. "Oh, and Sarah, Margaret is planning a family dinner for this Sunday. Nothing formal, just immediate family. She specifically asked me to make sure you and David would be there." "You wouldn't want to disappoint her, would you?" It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in the guise of a family invitation. "Of course," I replied weakly. "We'll be there." "Wonderful," he said, his smile never wavering. "I'm looking forward to spending more time together as a family." Sunday dinner at the Harrison house had always been a cherished tradition, but now it felt like walking into a lion's den. I spent the entire day beforehand trying to prepare myself mentally, rehearsing ways to avoid being alone with Richard while not making my avoidance obvious to the rest of the family. The dinner itself was typical Harrison family fare. Margaret had prepared a feast of roast chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, green beans from her garden, and homemade dinner rolls. Jennifer was home from medical school for the weekend, full of stories about her anatomy classes and clinical rotations. Rebecca had been promoted to assistant manager at the boutique where she worked and was excited about the increased responsibilities. David was in an excellent mood, having just secured a major contract for his engineering firm to design a new shopping complex. As he described the project to his family, his eyes lit up with the passion he always showed for his work. "That's wonderful, son," Richard said, raising his wine glass in a toast. "I'm so proud of how far you've come in your career. And I know, having Sarah's support at home makes all the difference in your success." His words sounded loving and supportive, but when he looked at me across the dinner table, there was something possessive in his gaze that made me feel like property rather than a person. "Sarah's been incredible," David agreed, reaching over to squeeze my hand. I don't know what I'd do without her. None of us know what we'd do without Sarah, Richard added meaningfully. She's become such an important part of our family in such a short time. Margaret beamed at this exchange, clearly delighted by the harmony between her husband and daughter-in-law. If only she knew the true nature of Richard's interest in me. After dinner, as we moved to the living room for coffee and Margaret's famous apple pie, I made sure to position myself in a chair where I would be surrounded by other family members. But Richard was patient and strategic. He waited until David and Jennifer got into an animated discussion about a construction project near her university, until Rebecca went to the kitchen to help her mother with the coffee service. Sarah, he said quietly, could you help me get something from my study? I have some papers David might be interested in for his new project. It seemed like an innocent request, but I knew better. I'm sure David would prefer to get them himself, I replied, not moving from my chair. He's busy talking with Jennifer, Richard said, his tone becoming slightly firmer. It will just take a moment. David, overhearing his father's request, looked over with a grateful smile. That's sweet of you to help, honey. Dad's always thinking about ways to help my career. With David's encouragement and the rest of the family present, I couldn't refuse without seeming unreasonably rude. I followed Richard down the hallway to his study, my heart pounding with each step. The study was exactly as I remembered from my early visits to the Harrison home, leather-bound, books lining the walls, awards and certificates displayed prominently, a massive oak desk that commanded respect. Richard closed the door behind us, and immediately the atmosphere changed. There are no papers, he said simply, turning to face me. I think you know that. I backed toward the door, but he moved to block my path. Richard, please. The family is right down the hall. Yes, they are, he agreed. Which means you need to be very quiet and very cooperative. We wouldn't want to alarm them, would we? He moved closer, and I found myself trapped between his imposing figure and the solid wood door. I've been very patient, Sarah. More patient than you deserve, considering how you've been avoiding me. I haven't been avoiding you, I lied. I've just been busy with work and don't lie to me. He cut me off, his voice taking on a harsh edge I'd never heard before. I know exactly what you've been doing, but it ends tonight. His hand reached out to touch my face, and I jerked away instinctively. The movement seemed to anger him, and his expression darkened. That's not the reaction I expect from my grateful daughter-in-law, he said coldly. Grateful for what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. For everything, he replied. For welcoming you into this family, for paying for your beautiful wedding, for making sure David's career flourishes, for taking care of those pesky student loans, for co-signing your mortgage when your credit wasn't quite good enough on its own. Each item on his list felt like a weight added to the chains binding me to him. I had known about some of his financial contributions to our life, but hearing them all listed out like this made me realize just how thoroughly he had positioned himself as our benefactor. David works hard for his success, I said weakly. He's talented and dedicated. David is talented, Richard agreed, but talent alone doesn't guarantee success in this business. Connections matter, recommendations matter, family loyalty matters. The threat was crystal clear. Richard controlled not just our financial stability, but David's professional future as well. One word from him could destroy everything my husband had worked for. What do you want from me? I whispered, though I dreaded the answer. I want you to stop pretending you don't feel this connection between us, he said, moving even closer. I want you to acknowledge what we both know is true. That you're attracted to me. That you've been thinking about me the same way I've been thinking. About you. That's not true, I protested. But my voice lacked conviction even to my own ears. Isn't it? He asked, his hand finally making contact with my cheek despite my attempts to avoid it. Then why are you trembling? Why are your pupils dilated? Why is your breathing so shallow? I was trembling, but not from attraction, from terror. My body's stress response was being interpreted by this predator as arousal, and there was nothing I could say to convince him otherwise. I'm scared, I admitted. This is wrong, Richard. I'm married to your son. And that makes it even more exciting, doesn't it? He asked, his thumb stroking my cheek in a gesture that would have seemed tender to an outside observer but felt violating. To me, the forbidden nature of it, the risk, the intensity. Before I could respond, his other hand grabbed my waist, pulling me against him. Just one kiss, he whispered, the same words he'd used in my kitchen weeks earlier. One kiss to seal our understanding. I turned my head away, but he caught my chin with his free hand, forcing me to look at him. Sarah, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're going to be part of this family for the rest of your life. We can make that a pleasant experience for everyone, or we can make it difficult. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made us both freeze. Richard? Sarah? Did you find those papers? It was Margaret's voice, getting closer to the study door. Richard immediately released me, stepping back and smoothing his hair with practiced ease. Just a moment, dear, he called out, his voice perfectly normal. To me, he whispered urgently, think about what I've said. Think about what's at stake for David, for your marriage, for your future. We'll continue this conversation very soon, Hitai. Opened the door just as Margaret reached it, carrying a tray with coffee cups. Here we are, he said cheerfully, holding up a random folder from his desk. Some information about zoning regulations that might be helpful for David's project. Margaret smiled at us both, completely oblivious to what had just transpired. You two were gone so long, I thought you might like some coffee in here. How thoughtful, Richard replied, accepting a cup. Sarah and I were just having a lovely chat about her teaching career. She's so dedicated to those children. I managed to take a cup with shaking hands, hoping Margaret wouldn't notice my distress. Thank you, I mumbled. Of course, dear, Margaret said warmly. You look a bit pale. Are you feeling all right? Just tired, I said, the excuse I seem to use constantly these days. It's been a busy week at school. We returned to the living room, where David immediately wanted to examine the papers his father had retrieved. I sat in silence for the rest of the evening, mechanically responding to conversation while my mind reeled from what had happened in the study. Richard's behavior for the remainder of the evening was perfectly appropriate. Loving father and grandfather, devoted husband, respected family patriarch, but every so often he would catch my eye across the room, and his expression would remind me of the threat hanging over my head. When David and I finally left for home that night, I felt like I was carrying a terrible secret that was slowly poisoning me from the inside. In the car, David chattered happily about the zoning information his father had provided, completely unaware that his wife had just been assaulted by the man he looked up to most in the world. Dad's always looking out for us, David said as we pulled into our driveway. I'm so lucky to have such a supportive family. And they all love you so much, Sarah. I can see how much Dad especially has taken to you. He's always asking about you, wanting to make sure you're happy and settled into the family. If only he knew the true nature of his father's interest in my happiness and settlement into the family. That night, lying awake next to my sleeping husband, I faced the horrible reality of my situation. Richard had made it clear that he would not be deterred by my resistance. He had also made it equally clear that he held all the power in this relationship, financial, professional, and social. He could destroy our lives with a few phone calls, and he was counting on my love for David to keep me silent and compliant. I was trapped in a nightmare that was only beginning, and I could see no way out that wouldn't destroy everything and everyone I loved. Richard had calculated his approach perfectly, positioning himself as our benefactor and protector, while simultaneously making himself my greatest threat. The worst part was knowing that this was just the beginning. Each encounter was escalating, and Richard was growing bolder and more demanding. How long would it be before he stopped asking and simply took what he wanted? And when that happened, would I have the strength to resist, knowing what it would cost David and our future together? I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but all I could see was Richard's face, his predatory smile, and the promise in his eyes that our next encounter would be even more terrifying than this one. Winter arrived, early in Portland that year, bringing with it shorter days and an oppressive gray sky that seemed to mirror my increasingly dark mood. By December 1988, I had been living in a state of constant anxiety for over 2 months. Richard's threats and advances had become a regular part of my life, carefully timed for moments when we were alone or when the family was distracted. He had developed a pattern of creating opportunities to corner me, volunteering to drive me places when David was busy, showing up at our house with various excuses when he knew David would be at work, even calling me at school during my lunch break to have what he called private conversations about family matters. During one particularly disturbing phone call in late November, he had described in explicit detail what he wanted to do to me, speaking in that calm, conversational tone that made his words even more terrifying. When I tried to hang up, he reminded me that he was on the school board and could easily arrange for my teaching position to be eliminated due to budget constraints. The psychological toll was becoming unbearable. I had lost 15 pounds since our wedding, developed chronic insomnia, and found myself jumping at shadows. My performance at work was suffering. I was distracted during lessons, irritable with my students, and barely keeping up with grading and lesson planning. David noticed my deteriorating condition, but attributed it to the stress of our first year of marriage and my heavy workload at school. "Maybe you should take some time off for the holidays," he suggested one evening as I sat staring blankly at a stack of ungraded math tests. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." "I'm fine," I insisted, the lie coming automatically now. "Just tired, but I wasn't fine, and we both knew it." I was slowly falling apart, and Richard was counting on that deterioration to make me more vulnerable to his advances. The breaking point came during the Harrison family's annual Christmas party. It was always a grand affair. The house decorated like something from a magazine, catered food, live music, and guest lists that included Portland's social and business elite. Margaret had been planning for weeks, and she had specifically asked me to arrive early to help with last-minute preparations. "You have such wonderful taste, dear," she had said when asking for my help. "And you're so good with details. I could really use another woman's perspective on the final touches." I should have made an excuse, should have found a way to avoid being at the Harrison house before the other guests arrived. But Margaret had been so kind to me, and I didn't want to disappoint her. David had a client meeting that afternoon and would join us later, so I arrived at the house around 3 p.m. to help with preparations. Margaret was in her element, directing the catering staff and putting finishing touches on the elaborate decorations. The house looked spectacular, every room adorned with garlands and lights, a massive Christmas tree in the living room, and tables laden with elegant holiday displays. "Sarah, you're a lifesaver," Margaret said, rushing around with her usual nervous energy before a big party. "Could you help me with the guest bathroom upstairs? I want to make sure it has fresh towels and that little vase of winter roses." I spent about 20 minutes in the upstairs bathroom, arranging towels and making sure everything was perfect for the evening's guests. When I came back downstairs, I found the house strangely quiet. The catering staff had apparently left to pick up additional supplies, and Margaret was nowhere to be seen. "Margaret?" I called out, walking through the empty downstairs rooms. She had to run to the florist. Richard's voice came from behind me, making me spin around in alarm. He was standing in the doorway to his study, already dressed for the party, in an expensive charcoal suit. "Some problem with the centerpieces for the dining room table." My heart immediately began racing. We were alone in the house, and from his expression, I knew this was no coincidence. "When will she be back?" I asked, backing toward the front door. "Not for at least an hour," Richard replied, moving to block my path to the exit. "The florist is across town, and you know how Margaret is about getting everything perfect. She'll probably end up redesigning the whole arrangement while she's there." I looked around desperately for another escape route, but Richard had positioned himself strategically. The back door was through the kitchen, which would require me to get past him. The only other option was the staircase, but that would trap me on the second floor. "I should go home and get ready for the party," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "David will be wondering where I am." "David won't be home for hours," Richard said, his voice taking on that predatory tone I had learned to fear. "His meeting with the Henderson group always runs late. I should know. I'm the one who recommended him for that project." Another reminder of his control over David's career, another link in the chain that bound me to his will. "Richard, please, we can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" he asked innocently, moving closer. "Having family conversations? Getting to know each other better? There's nothing wrong with a father-in-law and daughter-in-law spending time together. But there was nothing innocent about the way he was looking at me, nothing fatherly about his intentions. I could see the hunger in his eyes, the determination that told me this encounter would be different from the others. "You look beautiful today," he said, his gaze traveling over my body in a way that made my skin crawl. I was wearing a simple, red sweater and black slacks, nothing provocative or inappropriate, but the way he looked at me made me feel exposed and vulnerable. "Thank you," I mumbled, still trying to find a way past him to the door. "Red is definitely your color," he continued, reaching out to touch the fabric of my sweater. "It brings out the warmth in your skin, the fire in your hair. No wonder David fell so hard for you." His hand lingered on my arm, and I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Richard, please let me go. This isn't appropriate." "What isn't appropriate," he said, his voice hardening, "is the way you've been treating me, avoiding my calls, making excuses to skip family gatherings, acting like I'm some kind of monster when all I've done is try to welcome you into our family." "You've done more than welcome me," I said, finding some courage in my desperation. "You've made me uncomfortable with your comments and your touching and your threats about David's career." Richard's expression darkened at my directness. "Threats? I've never threatened anyone. I've simply pointed out the reality of your situation. David's success depends on family support, and family support depends on family loyalty." He moved even closer, and I found myself backed against the wall in the foyer, trapped beneath the elegant staircase. "And you haven't been very loyal lately. Have you, Sarah?" "I've been loyal to David," I said firmly. "That's where my loyalty belongs." "David is my son," Richard replied, his hand moving to my face despite my attempts to turn away. "Which means loyalty to family includes loyalty to me, and I think it's time you showed me just how loyal you can be." Before I could protest, his mouth was on mine, his lips forcing a kiss that felt like assault. I tried to push him away, but he was much stronger than me, his hands holding my face in place while he violated me with his mouth. "Stop," I gasped when he finally pulled back for a moment. "Please, Richard, stop. I've waited long enough," he said, his breathing heavy. "I've been patient. I've been gentle. I've given you time to adjust to the idea. But my patience has limits." His hands moved to my waist, gripping me tightly and pulling me against his body. I could feel his arousal, and the reality of what he intended to do hit me like a physical blow. "No," I said more forcefully, trying to push against his chest. "I won't let you do this. I'll tell David. I'll tell Margaret. I'll tell everyone what kind of man you really are." Richard laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Will you? And what exactly will you tell them? That your loving father-in-law who has done nothing but support you and David, Tried to give you a hug? That you misinterpreted his affection as something inappropriate? His hands were moving now, one sliding up my back, the other moving down toward my hip. Who do you think they'll believe, Sarah? A respected businessman who has spent 30 years building his reputation in this community? Or a young woman with a history of family problems who might be looking for attention? The cruel accuracy of his words was devastating. He was right. My word against his would never be believed, especially by David, who worshipped his father. Please, I whispered, tears starting to flow down my cheeks. Don't do this. I'm begging you. Shh, he said, his voice taking on a grotesque parody of comfort. It's going to be all right. Once you stop fighting this, you'll see that it's what you wanted all along. The attraction has been there from the beginning. I've seen it in your eyes, felt it in the way you respond to my touch. His hand slid under my sweater, his fingers touching my skin in a way that made me feel physically sick. I tried to scream, but only a weak sound emerged from my throat. That's better, he said, misinterpreting my strangled cry as submission. Just relax and let this happen. Let me show you how much I care about you. But just as his hand moved toward my bra, we heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Richard immediately froze, his predatory instincts alert to the potential danger of discovery. Expecting someone? I managed to gasp. Richard cursed under his breath, quickly stepping back and smoothing his hair. Through the front window, we could see Margaret's car pulling into the driveway. This isn't over, he whispered, urgently as he straightened his tie. We will finish this conversation, Sarah. Soon. By the time Margaret walked through the front door, her arms full of floral arrangements, Richard was calmly examining some papers on the hall table, and I was trying desperately to compose myself. Oh, good, you're both still here, Margaret said, cheerfully. Sarah, dear, you look a bit flushed. Are you feeling all right? Just warm, I managed. I was helping with preparations and got a bit overheated. Margaret looked concerned. Well, sit down and rest for a moment. Richard, could you help me carry these arrangements to the dining room? As Richard moved to help his wife, he passed close enough to me to whisper, Christmas morning. David always goes for that early run on holidays. We'll have plenty of time then. The threat was clear and specific. He was planning our next encounter, confident that I wouldn't be able to resist him indefinitely. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I helped Margaret with final preparations, my hands shaking as I arranged flowers and set out serving dishes. David arrived around 6, just as the first guests were beginning to arrive, and immediately noticed my distressed state. Honey, you look exhausted, he said, pulling me aside with concern. Maybe you should go home and rest. I can make excuses to Mom. I wanted desperately to take his offer, to escape the house and Richard's predatory presence. But I also knew that leaving early would only anger Richard and potentially make future encounters even worse. I'm fine, I lied again. Just tired, from all the preparations. The party itself was a nightmare of forced normalcy. I had to smile and make conversation with guests while Richard circulated through the room, playing the perfect host while catching my eye periodically to remind me of what had happened and what he planned to happen next. When people complimented him on his beautiful family, he would put his arm around me and pull me close, his hand lingering in ways that seemed affectionate to observers but felt possessive and threatening to me. We're so blessed to have Sarah as part of our family, he told one business associate, his grip on my waist tightening as he spoke. She's brought such joy and excitement to all of our lives. By the time the party ended and we finally went home, I was emotionally and physically exhausted. David, who had enjoyed himself thoroughly, chatted happily about the evening as we got ready for bed. Dad seemed especially happy tonight, he observed. I think having you as part of the family has really brought out his paternal side. He's always talking about you, always making sure you're comfortable and included in everything. If only he knew the true nature of his father's interest in my comfort and inclusion. That night, As David slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and facing the horrible reality of my situation. Richard had made it clear that he would not be deterred, that he would continue escalating his attacks until he got what he wanted. His threat about Christmas morning was specific and credible. David did always go for a long run on holiday mornings, leaving me alone and vulnerable. I had to do something. I had to find a way to protect myself, even if it meant risking everything. I had built with David and his family, but what options did I have? Who would believe me? And even if someone did believe me, what would be the cost? As I lay there in the darkness, I began to formulate a desperate plan. I couldn't continue living like this, couldn't continue being terrorized by the man who was supposed to be my protector and family patriarch. Something had to change, even if it meant destroying everything I loved in the process. Christmas was just 5 days away, and I knew with sickening certainty that Richard intended to make it a holiday I would never forget. Christmas morning, 1988. Dawned gray and cold, with a light snow dusting the streets of Portland. Under normal circumstances, it would have been magical, the kind of peaceful, beautiful morning that makes Christmas feel special. Instead, I woke up with a sense of impending doom that made my stomach churn. David stirred beside me around 7 a.m., stretching and yawning before rolling over to kiss my cheek. "Merry Christmas, beautiful," he said, his voice warm with sleep and contentment. "Ready for our first Christmas as a married couple?" "Merry Christmas," I replied, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice while my mind raced with anxiety about what the day would bring. We had planned to spend Christmas morning at home, opening gifts and enjoying a leisurely breakfast before heading to the Harrison house around noon for the traditional family celebration. It should have been perfect, but all I could think about was Richard's threat. Christmas morning. David always goes for that early run on holidays. Sure enough, after we opened our gifts to each other, David had given me a beautiful pearl necklace, while I had gotten him a leather briefcase he'd been admiring. He began putting on his running gear. "I'm going to get in a quick 5-mile run before we head to Mom and Dad's," he said, lacing up his running shoes. "Want to come with me? The snow makes everything look so beautiful." My heart hammered against my ribs. This was exactly what Richard had predicted, exactly what he was counting on. "I'm still feeling a bit tired," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. "You go ahead. I'll start getting ready for dinner." David kissed me goodbye, bundling up in his winter running gear. "I'll be back in about an hour. Love you." "Love you too," I replied, the words feeling like they might be the last normal ones we'd ever exchange. After David left, I double-checked all the locks on our doors and windows, though I knew it wouldn't matter if Richard was determined to get inside. I tried to distract myself by cleaning up our gift wrapping and organizing David's new briefcase, but my hands were shaking so badly, I could barely function. 20 minutes after David left, I heard a car door slam in our driveway. My blood turned to ice as I peered through the front window and saw Richard walking up our front path, carrying what appeared to be a wrapped gift. When the doorbell rang, I stood frozen in our living room, hoping that if I didn't answer, he would simply leave. But the ringing continued, followed by knocking, and then his voice calling through the door. "Sarah, dear, I know you're in there. David's car is gone, but yours is still in the driveway. I have a special Christmas gift for you from Margaret." The mention of Margaret made me hesitate. What if it really was just a gift delivery? What if I was being paranoid? But when I looked through the peephole, something about Richard's expression told me this was no innocent visit. "Sarah," he called again, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Open the door. We both know I'm not going away." With trembling hands, I unlocked the door but left the chain latch engaged, opening it just a crack. "Richard, this isn't a good time. David will be back soon." "No, he won't," Richard said with certainty that chilled me. "David's runs on Christmas morning take at least an hour and a half. He likes to go all the way out to the river trail when there's snow. I should know. I'm the one who got him into that routine when he was a teenager. Another calculated detail. Another way Richard had orchestrated this moment. Please just leave the gift and go, I pleaded. I'll tell Margaret thank you. I'm afraid this particular gift requires a personal delivery, Richard said. And then I heard the sound that made my heart stop. A key turning in our lock. He had a key to our house. Somehow, he had gotten a copy of our house key. The door pushed open despite the chain latch, which snapped under the pressure of his shoulder against the door. Richard stepped inside, closing and locking the door behind him with a casualness that spoke of careful planning. How did you get a key? I asked, backing away from him toward the living room. I'm a real estate developer, Sarah, he said, setting the wrapped box on our entry table. I have connections with locksmiths throughout the city. Getting a copy? Made from David's spare key was remarkably simple. The premeditation of it, the fact that he had been planning this invasion of our home for who knows how long, made me feel sick. Get out, I said, trying to sound stronger than I felt. Get out right now, or I'll call the police. Richard laughed, pulling his cell phone from his jacket pocket and setting it on the table next to the gift. Go ahead, call them, tell them. Your father-in-law came to deliver a Christmas present and you want him arrested. Let's see how that conversation goes. He was right, and we both knew it. Without evidence of wrongdoing, it would look like I was having some kind of breakdown, accusing a respected family man of assault based on nothing more than my own paranoia. What do you want? I asked, continuing to back away from him. I want to finish what we started at the Christmas party, he said, removing his coat and hanging it casually on our coat rack as if he belonged here. I want you to stop playing these childish games and accept what's going to happen between us. Nothing is going to happen between us, I said firmly, though my voice was shaking. I'm married to your son. I love David. And you can continue loving David, Richard said reasonably, following me into the living room. This has nothing to do with your marriage. This is about family loyalty, about showing gratitude for everything I've done for you both. He moved toward me with predatory patience, like a cat stalking a cornered mouse. I grabbed our cordless phone from the coffee table, but he shook his head with amusement. Who are you going to call, Sarah? The police, who will see a respected businessman visiting his daughter-in-law on Christmas morning? David, who will rush home to find his father helping you with some household emergency? Margaret, who will wonder why you're so upset about her husband delivering her Christmas gift to you? Every option he listed sounded exactly like the impossibly complex trap he had constructed around me. No matter what I did, he would find a way to make me look unreasonable or unstable. I have other plans for that phone anyway, he said, taking it from my trembling hands and turning it off. We don't want any interruptions. The casual way he disabled our communication made the reality of my situation crash down on me. I was trapped in my own home with a predator who had planned every detail of this assault. Richard, please, I said, tears starting to flow down my cheeks. Please don't do this. Think about Margaret. Think about David. Think about your family. I am thinking about family, he replied, moving closer. I'm thinking about how much closer we're all going to be after today, how much more intimate our family relationships are going to become. His hands reached for me, and I tried to run toward the kitchen, hoping to reach the back door. But Richard was faster and stronger, catching me around the waist and pulling me back against him. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, he said, his voice in my ear as I struggled against his grip. I promise you'll enjoy it once you stop fighting. Let me go, I screamed, hoping our neighbors might hear despite the early hour and the snow muffling sound. Scream all you want, Richard said calmly. The Hendersons are visiting their daughter in Seattle for Christmas, and the Johnsons are elderly and can barely hear their own television. No one is going to save you, Sarah. His hands were moving over my body now, touching me in ways that made me feel physically ill. I tried to break free, scratching at his arms and kicking backward, but he was much larger and stronger than me. "That's enough," he said harshly when I managed to elbow him in the ribs. His grip tightened painfully around my waist, and he began, dragging me toward the staircase. "Upstairs. Now." The implication was clear. He intended to assault me in the bedroom I shared with David, in the bed where my husband and I had made love as newlyweds. The violation of that sacred space was almost as devastating as the physical assault itself. "No," I sobbed, grabbing onto the banister as he tried to pull me up the stairs. "Please, Richard, no." "Yes," he said firmly, prying my fingers loose from the railing. "This is happening, Sarah. The only question is whether you're going to cooperate and make it pleasant for both of us, or whether I'm going to have to use more forceful methods." But just as he managed to drag me halfway up the staircase, we both heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Richard froze, his head turning toward the front window. "That's impossible," he muttered. "David never comes back early from his Christmas runs." But it wasn't David's car in the driveway. It was Margaret's distinctive blue Cadillac. Through the window, we could see her getting out of the car, carrying what appeared to be another wrapped gift. "Margaret," I gasped, hope flooding through me for the first time in months. Richard's face contorted with fury and panic. "She's not supposed to be here," he hissed. "She said she was staying home to prepare Christmas dinner." The doorbell rang, followed by Margaret's cheerful voice. "Sarah, dear, Richard said he was coming over to deliver your special gift, but I realized I forgot to include the card. Are you home?" Richard's grip on me loosened slightly as he calculated his options. This was my chance, perhaps my only chance. "Margaret," I screamed at the top of my lungs. "Help me, please help me." Richard's hand clamped over my mouth, but it was too late. Margaret had heard something alarming in my voice, and we could hear her trying the front door, which Richard had locked behind him. "Sarah? Sarah, what's wrong?" Margaret's voice was filled with sudden concern. "Richard, are you in there? Open this door right now." The sound of her jiggling the door handle was followed by the jingle of keys. Margaret had her own key to our house, something she had insisted on, for emergencies. Richard released me completely now, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to explain this situation. I stumbled down the stairs, my legs barely supporting me, just as Margaret's key turned in the lock. The door opened to reveal Margaret's face, which immediately transformed from concern to shock as she took in the scene before her, her husband disheveled and panicked at the top of the stairs, her daughter-in-law sobbing and trembling at the bottom, the obvious signs of a struggle. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, Richard, what have you done?" "Margaret, this isn't what it looks like," Richard began, his voice taking on that smooth, persuasive tone he used to control situations. "Sarah was having some kind of breakdown and I was just trying to help her." "Liar!" I screamed, finding my voice through the terror and relief. "He was trying to rape me. He's been threatening me for months, touching me, cornering me. He broke into our house to assault me." Margaret's eyes moved between her husband and me, and I could see the exact moment when understanding dawned. Her face went completely white, and she gripped the doorframe for support. "Richard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is this true?" "Of course it's not true," Richard said, descending the stairs with his hands raised as if approaching a frightened animal. "She's obviously having some kind of mental health crisis. You know how unstable her family background is." "Stop," Margaret said, her voice suddenly strong and clear. "Just stop talking." She looked at me with eyes that held a mixture of horror, compassion, and something else. Something that looked like recognition, as if she had suspected something like this might happen. "Sarah," she said gently, "did my husband assault you?" "Yes," I sobbed, the word coming out like a confession that had been trapped inside me for months. "Yes, he's been threatening me since before the wedding. He said he would destroy David's career if I didn't let him." Margaret's face crumpled as the full scope of her husband's behavior became clear. She looked at Richard with an expression of disgust and disappointment that was devastating to witness. "Get out," she said quietly. "Margaret, you can't possibly believe," Richard started. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice echoing through our small house. "Get out of this house right now before I call the police myself." For the first time since I'd known him, Richard Harrison looked powerless. Faced with his wife's fury and the collapse of his carefully constructed facade, he seemed to shrink before our eyes. "This isn't over," he said, but the threat lacked his usual conviction. "Yes, it is," Margaret replied firmly. "It's completely over, now get out." Richard grabbed his coat and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him with such force that our Christmas decorations rattled on their shelves. As soon as he was gone, Margaret rushed to me, wrapping her arms around my trembling form and holding me while I sobbed out months of fear, shame, and terror. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her own tears falling into my hair. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it, didn't protect you. I should have known, should have seen the signs." "You couldn't have known," I managed between sobs. "He was so careful, so calculated." "No," Margaret said firmly, pulling back to look at me with eyes full of pain and regret. "I did know. I suspected. I saw things, felt things, but I convinced myself I was imagining it because I didn't want to believe my husband could be capable of such things." Her admission was both heartbreaking and validating. I wasn't crazy, wasn't imagining the inappropriate behavior. Even his own wife had noticed something wrong. "What do we do now?" I asked, suddenly panicked about David's reaction, about the family's future, about everything that would change now that the truth was exposed. Margaret held my hands. In hers, her face set with determination I had never seen before. "Now we protect you," she said. "Now we make sure he never hurts you or anyone else ever again. And now we figure out how to tell David that his father is a monster." As we sat there in my living room, surrounded by Christmas decorations and the wreckage of the Harrison family's perfect facade, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. The nightmare wasn't over, but for the first time, I wasn't facing it alone. Margaret had seen the truth, had chosen to believe me over her own husband. Together, we would find a way to ensure that Richard Harrison could never victimize anyone again. But first, we had to figure out how to tell David that his hero was actually a predator, and that his perfect family was built on lies, manipulation, and abuse. Margaret and I spent the next hour sitting on my living room couch, planning how to tell David the truth about his father. We both knew it would be devastating news, but we also knew he deserved to hear it from us rather than discovering it in some other way. "He's going to be heartbroken," Margaret said, her voice heavy with the weight of what we were about to do to her son. "Richard has been his hero since childhood. This will shatter everything David believes about his family." "I know," I replied, my heart already breaking for the pain David would soon experience. "But he needs to know the truth, and he needs to know that you and I are united in this." When David returned from his run an hour later, still glowing from exercise and the Christmas spirit, his smile immediately faded when he saw our tear-stained faces and serious expressions. "What's wrong?" he asked, looking between his mother and wife with growing alarm. "Did something happen? Where's Dad?" Margaret took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She told David everything, about walking in on Richard assaulting me, about the months of inappropriate behavior that led up to this moment, about her own suspicions that she had ignored because she didn't want to believe the truth. David's face went through a series of emotions as the story unfolded: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, devastated acceptance. When Margaret finished speaking, he sat in stunned silence for several minutes. "Dad did this?" he finally whispered, looking at me with eyes full of pain and guilt. "He's been hurting you all this time?" And I didn't see it? He was very careful, I said gently. He made sure you would never see it, never suspect. That's how predators operate. They count on the love and trust of family members to shield them from consequences. David stood up abruptly and began pacing our small living room, his hands running through his hair in agitation. I should have protected you, he said, his voice breaking. I should have seen the signs, should have known something was wrong. This is not your fault, Margaret said firmly. The only person responsible for Richard's behavior is Richard himself. You couldn't have known because we deliberately kept it from you to protect you. Over the next several hours, David went through what I can only describe as a complete emotional breakdown and rebuilding. The father he had idolized, the man whose approval he had sought his entire life, was revealed to be a monster who had terrorized his own wife. It was like watching someone's entire worldview collapse and slowly reassemble into something new. By evening, David had made a decision that surprised both Margaret and me with its strength and clarity. We're going to the police, he said. Tonight. Dad needs to be arrested, and he needs to face consequences for what he's done. David, I said carefully, are you sure? Once we involve the police, there's no going back. Your father's reputation, his business, your family's standing in the community, it will all be destroyed. Good, David replied with a conviction that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him. If it's all built on lies and covered-up crimes, then it deserves to be destroyed. We spent that Christmas evening at the Portland Police Department, giving statements to Detective Maria Santos, a specialist in domestic violence and sexual assault cases. She listened to our story with professional compassion, taking detailed notes and asking pointed questions about dates, witnesses, and evidence. Mr. Harrison is well known in this community, Detective Santos warned us. Prosecuting someone of his stature will be challenging. Are you prepared for the scrutiny and criticism that will come with this decision? We're prepared, David answered for all of us. My wife's safety is more important than my father's reputation. The legal process that followed was long and painful, but ultimately successful. Richard was arrested on charges of sexual assault, stalking, and breaking and entering. The investigation revealed that I wasn't his first victim. Detective Santos uncovered 2 other women who had experienced similar harassment from Richard over the years, but had been too intimidated by his power and position to come forward. Margaret filed for divorce immediately, and with the support of an excellent attorney, she was able to secure most of the assets from Harrison Properties. She used part of that money to establish a foundation for supporting victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. It's the least I can do, she told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings that first year. I lived with a predator for 30 years and turned a blind eye to warning signs. I have a responsibility to make amends. Richard was ultimately sentenced to 8 years in prison, though he served only 5 with good behavior. During his incarceration, his business empire crumbled, his reputation was destroyed, and several of his former associates distanced themselves from the Harrison name entirely. The impact on our family was significant, but not insurmountable. Jennifer and Rebecca initially struggled to accept the truth about their father, but eventually they both came to understand that supporting their mother and sister-in-law was more important than defending a man who had committed inexcusable crimes. David and I went through months of couples counseling to deal with the trauma and its impact on our marriage. There were difficult times when I wondered if we could survive the shadow that Richard's actions had cast over our relationship. But David's unwavering support and his commitment to rebuilding trust helped us emerge stronger than before. I married you, not my family, he told me during one particularly difficult therapy session. If I have to choose between supporting you and supporting them, I choose you every time. We moved across the country to Denver, where David found a BIG position with an environmental engineering firm that had no connections to his father's business network. The fresh start was exactly what we needed to begin healing and building a life that was truly our own. In Denver, I returned to teaching, finding purpose in working with children who had experienced trauma in their own lives. My experience with Richard, as horrible as it had been, gave me insights into recognizing signs of abuse that many of my colleagues missed. Margaret visited us regularly, and over time she became the mother figure I had always wished for. Someone who truly put my well-being first, who listened without judgment, and who never minimized my experience or asked me to forgive and forget. 5 years after the assault, David and I welcomed our first child, a beautiful daughter we named Emma Margaret Harrison, honoring the woman who had saved me from her own husband. Holding Emma in my arms for the first time, I made a silent promise that she would grow up in a family where her safety and dignity were never compromised. Today, 34 years later, I can honestly say that Richard Harrison's attempt to destroy my life ultimately made me stronger. Emma grew up to become a prosecutor specializing in crimes against women and children. Her younger brother Michael became a therapist who works with trauma survivors. Both of my children know their grandfather's story, not because I wanted to burden them with family shame, but because I wanted them to understand that predators often hide behind respectable facades, and that speaking truth is always more important than protecting family secrets. Margaret lived to be 89, passing away peacefully just 2 years ago, surrounded by children and grandchildren who adored her. At her funeral, dozens of women spoke about how her foundation had helped them escape abusive situations or find the courage to report crimes against them. Richard died in prison during his final year of incarceration, alone and largely forgotten by the community that had once respected him. I felt no satisfaction in his death, but I did feel a sense of closure, knowing that he could never hurt anyone again. David retired last year after a distinguished career in environmental engineering, and we now split our time between Denver and a small cabin in the mountains where we volunteer with organizations that support abuse survivors. The nightmares stopped years ago, replaced by dreams of the future and the knowledge that speaking truth, even when it's difficult, even when it costs everything, is always the right choice. If you're watching this and you recognize your own story and mine, please know that you're not alone. There are people who will believe you, support you, and help you find safety. Shame belongs to the perpetrator, not the victim, and you deserve to live a life free from fear and abuse. Richard Harrison tried to break me, tried to silence me, tried to convince me that I was powerless. But in the end, the truth was more powerful than his threats. Love was stronger than his manipulation, and justice prevailed over his abuse of power. That's what I did when my father-in-law abused me for years. I found the courage to speak truth. I accepted the support of those who believed me, and I chose to build a life defined by healing rather than trauma. My name is Sarah Harrison, but you can call me Grandma Rose. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your voice matters, your truth matters, and you are stronger than you know. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.